Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Welcome to the fifth lecture of the Mindsperm virtual lecture series. Mindsperm is an initiative by a group of Ashoka Young India Fellows from Ashoka University's batch of 2019 to take learning beyond the four walls of a classroom. As a part of this initiative, we brought together eminent speakers from different academic backgrounds to share their views on how COVID-19 has impacted the lives of people in India as well as the global community. One of the pressing questions on everybody's minds right now is how long is it that this pandemic is going to last? And when is it that we finally be able to move on with our normal lives? For this very reason, today we have with us Professor Debayan Gupta, who has joined with us here today to talk about the trajectory of pandemic in India and give us a fresh perspective on understanding data and building effective policies. Professor Debayan Gupta holds a PhD from Yale University and is currently an assistant professor of computer science with Ashoka University. He's also visiting professor and research affiliate at MIT and MIT Sloan. Professor Gupta's primary area of interest include secure computation, cryptography, and privacy. While you might also find him dabbling in number theory, robotics, and machine learning. Without further ado, I present to you Professor Debayan. Over to you, Professor.
Hello, everyone. I hope people can hear me. First of all, I'll apologize for my background. Like everyone else here, we're at home under lockdown conditions, and that necessitates a certain amount of dishevelment, shall we say. When I was first asked to talk to people about this, my reaction was, hold on, I'm not a medical doctor. I shouldn't be talking about a disease. And this isn't my first talk about this. I was talking to a larger group of Indian scientists. But then once I got involved, I realized that, we talk about interdisciplinarity, we give it lip service, but it becomes tremendously important to have a holistic view of the situation when it comes to something like this. And before I start with my talk today, I want to say a few words about what this talk is not, right? I'm going to avoid the history over the past few months, what should have been done, what should not have been done. I'm not here to talk about that. What I want to do is not just give you information, but more importantly, try to give you the ability to better parse and understand all of this information that is coming at you and is going to be coming at you. Because this is not just a disease pandemic, it's also a pandemic of information, both real and false. And sometimes even well-intentioned real information, and I'll talk about some of those cases, can be incredibly confusing because they're written in this kind of academic jargon. So I'll try to demystify some of that, and I'll try to sort of describe what we understand to be some of the best steps possible in terms of controlling this in a reasonable and empathetic manner. So one more thing, I'm also going to try and avoid predictions. I'm really going to hate on all the predictions out there, but while simultaneously talking about how important those predictions are, I'll have an example or two of predictions, but just to be clear, these are meant to be illustrative, not predictive, okay? And I'll also try to analyze some of the current data. So let me just share my screen. I have a lovely little presentation I've worked on for this, and I hope you like it. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. So I thought I'd start with this image. I looked around for around the internet for images of India, and this was one of the things that came up, an Indian crowd. And I think this is it's really, really critical. We start here. We base our foundations at this point, because otherwise we'll be stuck treating the disease instead of treating people. And I think all of our discussions need to start and end by how we can help and better involve more people in this story, in the story of our fight against this virus. So as far as possible, you will notice a conspicuous absence of any virus-related imagery throughout this. I think we should put much more of our focus on the people of our country and the world. Okay. So let's get started. Now, all of you probably have been trolling around YouTube and reading all of these articles. There have been a few wonderful ones that I've read just in the past few days. And I'm guessing everyone already has their basic questions answered, right? When I started making this presentation, I started out by thinking I would start with what is a virus? And then I realized absolutely nobody cares about that. Not anymore. What we really want is to understand when will this end? When is this crazy time going to stop? And what can we do to help that happen? And like a good professor, instead of providing an answer immediately, I'm going to try and deconstruct the question. When will this end? Well, I'm going to look at the last few words, this and ending. If we're talking about ending, what do we mean by that? The coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, as the virus is called, just disappears? That's not going to happen. And by this, what do we mean? Do we mean these lockdowns? Do we mean thousands of people dying? What are we talking about exactly? So I think before we talk about any policy objectives, we need to have a clearer idea of what's going on, right? What do we mean by this ending? And as far as I'm concerned, ending, and I'm going to put it in sort of starker mathematical terms later on, ending basically means going back to our daily lives, perhaps with some changes, perhaps with some more social distancing, as it's called. I hate that phrase. I think it's much better to use the term physical distancing. I think it's a good time to be even socially, even closer to each other, if at all possible. I almost feel like, you know, those trucks that say on their backs sort of maintain distance? I feel I should have a sign like that on my pants or something. But when can we get out of this and get back to some semblance of our daily lives? That's what I mean by this. So the sad answer to that is that's not likely to happen anytime soon, okay? And in order to understand that, I'm just putting forth this graph, and again, you can see a very nice disclaimer on the bottom left that talks about how misleading this is. This is just a simple graph of the number of cases starting from the day a country hit 60 cases, okay? That's because different countries hit the pandemic hit different countries at different points in time. So having a plain graph that just starts at a particular date is essentially meaningless. Even this is not ideal. What I would have loved to do is slide them so that they all started when things were at the same angle. But if that happened, then all the lines would just be clustered together, and that's not good either. So I think starting at 60 or 100 cases or whatever, it gives us a nice view of what's going on. And you can see, those of you who understand compound interest can immediately see what's happening, right? Countries thought nothing was happening and zoom, it just went up. And now that green line on the bottom, that's India. We've been fairly lucky in that sense. And this is again misleading because we're not so sure of our numbers in India. We are not absolutely certain. In fact, I'm absolutely certain of the reverse, that the numbers being reported are not the real numbers. And I'll discuss why I believe that later on in this talk, right? But if you look at this, you'll see that India's curve does appear to be flatter, as it's called, and I'll talk a little bit more about flattening the curve in a bit, than that of other countries. Other countries seem to be going up much more steeply. Now, that's one way to look at the data. And in that sense, the idea is as we stop growing so quickly, maybe we can start taking some steps. That is a hope. Turns out, not such a good idea. Another way to look at it is the so-called doubling rate. Essentially here, all we're seeing is that how many days does it take to double from sort of half your number? And here, sort of the higher up you are, the better you are. And you can see that different countries have done this at different rates, and India is somewhere in the middle right now. But again, I'm going to argue that this is very, very misleading. And a large part of why all of this stuff is misleading is because of our current mental state. We're in this lockdown world where we're somehow under the impression that if we just carry on this lockdown long enough, it's going to somehow stop the virus in its tracks. The sad truth is that lockdowns do not end diseases, right? It's just going to continue. It is essentially a delaying action. It is there to slow things down. And that's very good. Lockdowns can be important if implemented correctly. And India's lockdown, with all its problems, has in many ways served some purposes. But all of that will be for naught if we do not end the lockdown correctly. Because what we don't want is we end the lockdown and a month and a half from now, we're back where we started, right? That is sadly a situation that is a very real possibility. But since I said lockdowns don't end diseases, what does? When does coronavirus, quote unquote, end in some sense? The answer is that it ends when a sufficient percentage of the population is somehow immune to it, right? Now, this immunity can come through artificial means, such as a vaccine. It can come through what is being known as herd immunity. You get the disease and then you recover. Although I'll sort of put a caveat there. There have been some sort of stories that have talked about reinfection. I don't really believe those, but I should say that. And the other is medicines. So I'll go through all of these one at a time. First, vaccines. We've been hearing about this stuff on the news a lot. In short, that's not going to happen anytime soon. You'll see a lot of news about this university and that university and this lab and that lab. We've come up with no, they have not. Okay. Vaccines are going to take at least a year, 18 months, if we're lucky. That is a super fast time to make a vaccine. And that's because you need to do it the right way. You also need to make sure that, if you inject 1 million people with the vaccine, half of them don't die 3 years later out of some sort of strange effect, right? There are also other issues. We won't go into that. What you'll also hear is a lot of background talk about using old school vaccines, talking about how BCG and polio vaccinations can somehow help what's the innate immune system, etc., to fight the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, off better. The point of this is all of these things are going to take time, a lot of time. Now, perhaps if the vaccine candidate is something like a modified polio or something that's already in large scale manufacturing, that's one story. On top of the time taken, if it's a new drug or a new vaccine, you can immediately imagine there's going to be a huge political backlash, right? If the vaccine can be produced and, where do the first 1 crore vaccines go? Do they go to the US, to Germany, to India? How does that work? So there's a whole political story that's likely to unfold around vaccines and medicines. But regardless of that, the vaccine stuff isn't going to happen for a year, at least. Now, the other side of the story, so I'm going to skip to medicines now, are some kind of medicine that can somehow control the virus. Now, we don't know of stuff that kills viruses. Viruses, well, you can't really kill one. It's very strange. Viruses straddle this middle ground between living and non-living beings, right? They're not really alive, so how can you kill something like that? But one can render it inactive, render it useless, so equivalent to killing it. And you'll hear a lot about many candidates. I can name, I don't know if I can name all 40, I can name quite a few off the top of my head. You'll hear about Gilead's remdesivir. You'll hear about ivermectin. I'm sure all of you've heard of hydroxychloroquine. Sorry. All of these medicines, again, many of them are promising candidates. The hydroxychloroquine one, I personally believe is not. However, there are many people who believe it is, and that's not advice you should be taking from me. There are medical experts who should be giving that advice. The point of this matter is no matter which one of these medicines you go for, it's going to require extensive amounts of testing and time before we can get that either. Again, many, many, many months. There's no way we're going to be able to get that medicine out within the next few months. And our outbreak is likely to continue in that period, right? Your virus isn't going to say, you need time to make your medicine. We're just going to pause for a moment. So that's not going to happen.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just one question, sir. Sir, how is it different from the situation of Ebola in that case? Because the Ebola was contained entirely in Africa and was contained, I mean, it did not spread to the rest of the world. How is this situation then different? Was there a vaccine that developed over there? Was there stronger lockdown?
Sure. So vaccines and stuff came later, but even other than that, the way Ebola transmitted, right? The nature of the infection, all of these things played into it, right? So even more than Ebola, something that immediately comes to mind is the SARS and MERS epidemics, right? Here's the thing: if you were hit with MERS, everyone, including you, knew you were hit with MERS. Like you were almost dying. You knew you were sick, right? You kind of had to go to a hospital. You didn't really have much choice. The percentage of cases that were asymptomatic was very, very small. Here, it's a completely different story. There appears to be a fairly large number of cases, and I'll talk about that in detail later on, that appear to be essentially asymptomatic. There's also a period of time that's pre-symptomatic. So even before you develop the symptoms, there's a period of time when you're actually capable of infecting other people, right? So these factors have led, along with the fact that, there are more flights going out of China than there are out of different parts of Africa where it developed. Also the Lunar New Year in China, there were a lot of factors that sort of made this into a perfect storm. So because of those reasons, this one was able to spread. But of course, I want to make this clear that epidemiologists, many much more learned than I am, have been warning about something like this for many, many years. I mean, you must have seen, many of you will have seen this fairly, if you will excuse the pun, viral talk from George Bush from more than a decade ago, where he'd read a book on the Spanish flu, and I'll talk about the Spanish flu a little bit, and gotten scared, and he also thought something like this might happen. So it is, this particular disease is an interesting mix of factors, including the rate at which humanity has been moving, the way this spreads. It's also itself, the disease itself is a curious mix of upper and lower respiratory infection. Generally speaking, if something affects your lungs, it's deadlier. If it's higher up, it's less deadly. And this is somewhere in the middle. But the less deadly stuff spreads more, right? So if it's higher up, it tends to spread more. And this thing straddles the middle ground there. And later on, I'll talk about sort of bats and how it might have spread and sort of why it spread so quickly and all of that stuff also. But coming back to this idea of herd immunity, some people, somewhat unempathetically, in my opinion, have said things like, why don't we just let this thing spread, right? What's wrong with that? If you do that, it'll take 2 years to get herd immunity, and many, many, many people will die. I want to use the term millions, but I don't want to even say that. Many, many people will die. The Indian government, along with many other governments around the world, many other researchers, the idea they have come up with on how to sort of get out of these lockdown-like conditions is essentially having some sort of combination of what's known as a light switch method and zoned lockdowns. Now, zoned lockdowns, you can imagine, you do a lot of contact tracing, you aggressively do a lot of testing, you find out where the cases are, declare hotspots or red zones, have a buffer zone around them, and there are entire sort of detailed documents that the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has come up with in India. I shared one with you, Ashna, earlier on, that goes into how to do this zoning. The other aspect along with the zoning is the so-called light switch mechanism, which is the idea that, let's say something doubles every week, then it takes about 10 weeks to get from 1 to 1,000, and it takes another 10 weeks to get from 1,000 to 1,000,000. So if you can handle 1,000, if your hospital system can handle 1,000 cases, but it can't handle 1,000,000 cases, what you do is you let it grow for up to 1,000, just let it be there, and you say, my hospital system can handle it. It takes 10 weeks, and then you do some kind of zoned lockdown for the next couple of weeks. You lock down the hotspots, control those areas. Once things are controlled, you again let that happen. Experience from Hong Kong actually suggests that if you're doing high quality sort of isolation, contact tracing, and stuff like that, you can actually control this. It is possible to do so. Hong Kong, if you, as I'm sure you know, is fairly dense, so that's good for India. But of course, it's also significantly more organized bureaucratically than India. So since I mentioned testing, you'll hear a lot about different kinds of tests that are going around. You'll hear about these RT-PCR tests, the polymerase chain reactions, and the, okay, I'm not going to use all those bad words. There's these two kinds of tests, okay? One test for the virus itself, one test for the human reaction to the virus, okay? The antibody tests are the serological ones. They test for human reaction, and the ones looking at the virus itself are the PCR ones. And the idea is the PCR tests work while the person is infected, right? They might not work super early on, but once there's enough viruses in your system, so to speak, the PCR test is what you want to do. After about 7 days after infection, 7 to 10 days, the human antibodies become detectable, right? And these serological tests are generally more stable. They take less effort to perform, etc. And it's also a blood test. So you don't, another problem with testing is when you do the test, the test sample needs to be handled super carefully, right? So you need high biosafety level labs to do these tests. With blood tests, that is less so. So essentially, the two kinds of tests are testing for two different scenarios, right? Your PCR tests are checking to see if a person is currently infected, and your serological tests are essentially checking for, has this person had this disease already? And of course, it's already the case about 7 to 10 days after infection that the serological tests begin to show a positive result. Now, the problem with all this stuff is, as I was telling you slightly earlier, is that there are so many asymptomatic cases. There appear to be a fairly large number of cases. There was a Science article that said maybe for everyone you detect, there's 5 or 10 that you don't because of these sorts of reasons. There's a huge number of cases that are asymptomatic. Manufacturing tests, your manufacturing capacity also obviously gets into it. And what also, you further have to remember that these tests aren't perfect. There are false negatives and positives that occur from these tests. And that's actually part of that last point. I'm going to skip to it. When you hear number of tests done, unfortunately, there is nowhere near enough transparency from the Indian government or any other government, to be very frank, because the number of tests and the number of people tested are not the same thing. Depending upon the kind of test and the policy directives in place, you may test a person multiple times to be sure. So when you hear 10,000 tests done, that might mean 2,000 people tested, or it might mean 10,000 people tested, and you just don't know, right? On top of this, there are huge reporting issues. I'm in Bengal. I know for a fact that many of my local hospitals, when they send it to the state government for swab testing, aren't reporting to the central government at the same time. There's also a misrepresentation of the number of deaths that are taking place in India due to COVID. So this can happen due to different reasons, right? So suppose someone goes outside, this person is COVID positive, has the disease COVID-19, gets hit by a bus, right? You're not going to classify that as a COVID death. You're going to classify that as a traffic accident, right? But you can see how that line gets fuzzier and fuzzier. What if someone had severe heart disease and got hit by COVID, died, he or she only had 6 months to live anyway? Now, do you count that as COVID death or not? Now, it turns out different states and different authorities around the world, and even sub-authorities, have completely different measures on where to draw this line. So what they are reporting as a COVID death or not is different. Further, in India, there are some initial indications. So, for example, there was this, some people looked at the first few cases in Mumbai, the first 50 deaths in Mumbai, for example. And a significant fraction of those, over half, happened within a day of getting admitted, many within a few hours. Now, if you can imagine, if so many people are dying within a few hours of getting admitted, guess what? It's almost certain that quite a few people are dying before getting admitted, right? And you can imagine why. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who suspects they have the disease. You're going to tell yourself that, no, it can't be coronavirus. And even if it is, they're telling me there's no cure. What's the point? I'll just stay at home. I'll stay, and I'm going to get better. I'm going to get better. You're not going to tell anyone because your family is going to be hated by everyone around you. I'm sorry, but that's just the truth, right? Everyone's going to avoid you. If you go to the market, people might not give you stuff or talk to you. So the natural reaction is not to tell anybody and stay silent and stay put and just pray to God that this is just a cold and not coronavirus. That's what you would do. That's what I would do. And that's what everyone is doing, right? And all of this stuff about, physical, I mean, come on, it's such a privileged statement to make. When there are so many people in our country who live in tiny rooms with 7, 8, 9, 10 people in those rooms, it's not going to happen. And so when people get infected, they try their best to stay isolated, but they usually can't, is my guess. And my guess is that the real numbers are significantly higher because of this. Because when you have the disease, you're going to try and hide it. Until when? Until it is so very bad that you need a hospital. And at that point, you go to a hospital and you're almost dead. And that's why we're seeing so many people die, right? Hopefully, over the course of time, as people have become more and more aware, and I do credit the government with sort of trying to sort of push this feeling of we're all in this together, even though it may have done so in some very weird ways. But that feeling is important. I really want to push that idea. It is important that idea of togetherness, because that's how you can get people to come out despite their own personal interests, to come out and get tested, right?
So just one question.
Yeah.
So is it also possible that in order to get people to stay in, governments might actually intend to sort of lie also and present a more scary picture of the viral than it is? Because I know for a fact that it happened in the case of Ebola as well, where governments were continuously arguing whether or not to tell people that the cases have started reducing, just to make sure that they do practice social distancing.
Right. I wish is the answer to that. The problem is, my suspicion is even the government doesn't know how many cases we have, right? Nobody does. And until we understand that, until we have a better idea of what the real number of cases is, I mean, let me put it this way. This is, if you will excuse the language, the difference between a liar and a bullshitter, right? A liar cares about the truth. There is something in the truth that the liar wishes to hide, and therefore he or she constructs a lie. And often a lie reveals a lot about the person lying. A bullshitter just doesn't care about the truth, just says something to keep going. I don't believe that our government is a bullshitter. I'm not going to comment on the lie thing. I do not believe they are lying to us. I believe they're trying to be honest. But in many cases, the decision making is so siloed and they're so used to working in a sort of top-down fashion that they're not always able to do things correctly. I think they have good intentions, but I just think we don't know. Like when we're talking about things like death rates, it's like number of cases, number of deaths divided by number of actual cases. I think we don't know the numerator or the denominator in that fraction, right? Speaking of which, when we're talking about flattening this curve, I put in a pithy sentence saying, you know, it is good to know what you're flattening before you try to flatten, right? And the problem is, this is the aforementioned wrong prediction, and I've said this is not even wrong. It comes from something that Pauli said, and this is just sort of a fairly optimistic prediction of what the numbers might be. And it's done fairly simply, like no epidemiology here at all. Just take the curves from districts separately, project them individually, and then add them together to get an India total, right? You can't do India as a whole because things start at different places in different times. So you need to do hotspots at a time. And the answer is this is not even wrong. And that's from, not even wrong comes from the idea from this famous scientist named Pauli. And the story is that he had a physics student come up to him with this sort of proof, asking if this proof was right. And he says, right, this proof is not even wrong, right? So it's sort of like if you're asked, why do the stars twinkle? And you answer, oh, because the average height of waterfalls in Nigeria is more than 19 feet. And it's like, wait, what? If your data that you're trying to build, if your story has no real relation, no way to actually connect to a right or wrong answer, you can't even say it's wrong. And unfortunately, that's kind of how bad our data is right now, right? We need much, much better data. In fact, going back at earlier outbreaks. So one of the earliest cases in epidemiology was, well, John Snow is known for other things with a slightly different spelling right now, but he's one of the progenitors of the discipline. And he tracked a cholera outbreak to a Broad Street pump in London by basically just mapping out where everything occurred. And that's how we realized that cholera spread through sort of water and through sewage pipes and leaks in that in those systems, rather than the so-called miasma theory that was common at that time, right? The point I have all these pretty red spots up there is that we need data, and we just don't have it right now. Like the Indian government hasn't yet put forward like a proper heat map of India saying how many cases are happening over time in what way. And once we have more data like that, we can begin to build in proper systems. There are proper epidemiological models where you sort of bucket people into different groups, susceptible, infectious, recovered, and you move people between these different groups. So most of us hopefully are in the susceptible group, and then we can be infected, and then we are also infectious, and then we can be recovered. There's a more complicated version of the model that separates exposed people from infectious people. What's interesting is this model was also developed in India, it was developed by two Scottish people, but it was developed based on an epidemic on plague in Bombay. And it's one of the most famous curves that I've sort of put on the left over there. And there are people who are using much more complicated models than this simple one. Although most of the models that you've seen, the Michigan one or the Johns Hopkins ones, well, that one we just don't have enough data to know. They haven't put forward their data. But most of them are some variant of this sort of put people in different buckets and see how the disease progresses. And the idea is that depending on how infectious something is, as long as a certain proportion of the population has recovered or is somehow immune from the disease, the herd immunity thing that we talked about, at that point, the disease sort of stops spreading as much, right? So many of you have heard of this R naught factor, this R0, R naught factor. And that's essentially, how many people does one person infect, right? That number is believed to be somewhere around 2.4, 2.5, somewhere around that for COVID. For measles, it's much, much higher, for example, right? And the herd immunity, for those of you who are interested in the math, is basically just 1 minus 1 over that R naught. Okay, so in this case, the herd immunity would be 1 minus 1 over 2.4, which works out to be about 60.6, so about 60%. That's where, by the way, Angela Merkel probably got those numbers. So once about 60% of the population is somehow recovered from this or is immune to it, it sort of stops on its own. But we can't wait for that, right? But we don't need to. If we can slow this thing down with sufficient sort of social distancing measures and careful contact tracing, who cares if there's 1,000 cases a year, right? We can handle 1,000 cases a year. The problem occurs when there's too many cases happening in one shot. And that's what this entire flattening the curve thing is about. So the pandemic doesn't end, it just sort of becomes insignificant. And you can do some very simple back of the envelope calculations for that. You know, if you have 1 lakh beds, 14 days per admission due to COVID, you have 7,000 daily capacity, and therefore you can handle a certain number of infections per day, right? There should be 2 more zeros in that 700, like, anyway, doesn't matter. But you can do that back of the envelope calculation yourself. It's not that difficult. I've just messed up the number of zeros there. But as these rates of infections grow at different amounts, there is an increasing pressure on our medical system, right? And already that is happening. I was just talking to a medical doctor yesterday, and what happened is there was a patient came in, and he suspected after a while, you know, he didn't see the patient immediately. He went to see the patient the day after she'd been admitted, and he was like, this person has COVID symptoms. And the patient was then transferred to a government hospital. But now the question is, you need to quarantine everybody who was in contact with that patient now. And the moment that piece of news spreads that there was possibly, even before this person has been detected to be positive, that there was possibly a COVID positive patient in this hospital, nobody's going to that hospital anymore. And there are all of these secondary morbidities that are occurring because of that. Because our normal healthcare system is already sort of sitting scared, many things that would have been taken care of, would have been diagnosed, would have been treated, are not happening. And it's really a horrifying situation. And until we can understand the numbers of true infections and true deaths and separate out specific hospitals for those things and do the planning properly, we cannot solve that, right? So I'd already mentioned, as part of the answer to your question, this Mumbai deaths thing and the hit by a bus thing. I also want to mention a fairly recent piece of research that was conducted at Boston homeless shelter. And of course, this is a hotspot, so the absolute numbers are going to be higher. That's not what I'm interested in. So I want to double check my numbers before saying anything. So there were about 408 people in that shelter, 147 of whom tested positive, right? Horrible situation, that's one thing. What's scary is that of the people who tested positive, only 1/6 of them showed symptoms at the time. Only 1/6 of the people who tested positive were showing any kinds of symptoms. And remember, there were other people in the remaining part of the population who did not test positive, who had like normal coughs and sneezes and stuff, right? Now, one caveat, just because someone wasn't showing symptoms doesn't mean they are asymptomatic. They could also be pre-symptomatic. That is, 5 days later, maybe some of them did show symptoms. But this also matches up with some studies about pregnant women out of New York that also had a similar 1/6 number. Now, of course, again, the pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic stuff happens, but what it means is there's likely a significant number of people in India who are carriers, who can spread the disease, but who do not know that they have it unless they are tested. All right. So I'm going to pause for a second now, and I'm going to quickly ask you, Ashna, do you want me to go on to Q&A right now, or I can talk for a minute or two about searching for the source of this thing as well, if you like. Unless that's a Q&A question, then I can just answer it right now. Like, where did this start?
So we can probably just move on with the talk, and we'll take the questions at the end, if that's okay.
Sure. So I'll just start talking about the source thing.
Yeah.
So obviously I've written the answer down on the slide. It's bats, right? Eventually it's bats. And it's been bats for a lot of stuff. And the reason is that, you know, some scientists think it's because bats are the only mammal that can fly. And that has led to some interesting changes in its immune system. But for whatever reason, bats have a very interesting immune system, right? It can sort of cut off the virus or isolate it without really having too much inflammation and stuff. And bat species of various kinds, especially horseshoe bats, which are probably the actual source in this case, have hundreds upon hundreds of coronaviruses within, right? Humans have a few. The influenza, for example, is one, which is endemic to humans. But bats have hundreds upon hundreds of these. And because bat immune systems are so weird and powerful in strange ways, bats don't really get super sick from these. And bats can be co-infected by different strains of coronaviruses at the same time, and they're fine. The problem occurs when this jumps from a bat to anything else, and that anything else is doomed, right? What happened in this particular case, that it jumped from bats to something else, perhaps a pangolin, perhaps something else. And then from what we can understand from the DNA studies, well, RNA studies in this case, genomic studies, that there was a single point of contact. There was a single human who contracted it, and then it started spreading, right? We're not super sure whether it was actually that particular wet market in Wuhan. There are many people who suspect that it started somewhere else, then spread through the wet market to other places. We're not sure, and we won't be until China sort of lets lots of people go in and investigate properly. But it is almost certain that the eventual source of this thing was horseshoe bats. I also want to quickly mention, oh, that was 2 minutes exactly as predicted. I also want to quickly mention this thing about unequal data, especially in the wake of sort of me talking about how the Indian government hasn't been providing enough data. Nobody really has. And there's a lot of blame being put on China, for example, some of it quite legitimate, some of it rather racist. Unequal data has happened every single time there's been any kind of pressure on governments. So, for example, a lot of people have mentioned the Spanish flu. The one thing we're quite sure about in the case of the Spanish flu is that it wasn't Spanish as such. It didn't really start in Spain. Some people think it started in the Americas. Some people it started among British soldiers. But what essentially happened is 1918, First World War times, and there was a huge amount of censorship across all of these countries. And what happened is that because there was so much censorship, the war correspondents, reporters weren't actually allowed to report on the real number of deaths. And so the only country in that area that was reporting accurate data was Spain, because it was neutral, right? And it was talking about how the king was sick and how so many people were dying. And this created a false impression of the pandemic, of the epidemic being worst in Spain, when that was very much not the case, right? So these numbers that we see talking about how America has by far the largest number of cases and deaths, I'm not going to say that directly, but I will say part of those numbers, for some numbers being larger than others, part of it might also be due to unequal data and inequality in testing and sort of revealing and transparency, right?
Professor,
so
one question, sorry, on
yeah,
that.
sorry, go ahead.
We've seen in the past how data has been a very important source for us to find any kind of solutions to a problem, such as especially a pandemic like this. Why is it then that governments have not been so transparent? I mean, I understand that they want to save their own face as well, but then at the end of the day, this kind of a problem is going to affect everybody equally. It's not something that's contained entirely only in one country. So how is it that we can maybe prevent something like this from happening then?
So there are two different questions in there. I'll address the first one first, which is why haven't governments sort of gotten their acts together and become transparent? Because transparency is part of character. Like it's like saying, you know, if a mob boss says from tomorrow onwards, I want everyone to snitch on everyone. No, that's not going to happen, right? Because a certain amount of opacity has been built into India's system over time, right? And many other systems, like, you know, if your local road is bad, we're used to just complaining about it and doing nothing because many of us don't even know who to complain to. We claim to care about politics, but I guarantee you, if in one of my classrooms, I ask about how many of you know the names of your own councillors? What was in their manifesto? Who's your MLA? Who's your MP? Who's their main opponent? Most people have no real idea, right? So part of it is on us, part of it is on the government, but the point of the matter is that over time, for whatever reasons, we're not living in a transparent system and expecting that system to suddenly magically become transparent and work in like a well-oiled machine. That's just not going to happen, right? Sort of, I mean, that's sort of what I'm hoping some of that will emerge out of this sort of as a good result of that we're able to get a little bit more organized in our reactions to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. Not just in the case of a disease, but anything else really, right? Remember that, you know, India has a huge infant mortality factor as well. Like, it's not like people weren't dying due of entirely preventable causes before this. It's just that this is a new cause, which, given past experience, suggested that it could have grown very, very quickly, right? And in order to solve our current issue, we need to have responses. Like, sure, the lockdown was a powerful delaying action, but what do we do now? And I think the government plan from the Ministry of Health outlines some good steps. We need to take more. We need to have significantly more testing. We need to have our actions be calibrated. There has not been sufficient interaction with industry. Organizations like the CII and the Indian Chamber of Commerce and ASSOCHAM, all of these organizations have given a lot of information to the government about how they're willing to sort of stagger their workforces, sort of change things around. Not enough has been done on that front. Obviously, like, the government has a lot to do at this time. It's juggling so many different issues. But we do need to get the industry working to a large extent. There's been a lot of regulatory slowdowns. So, for example, with testing kits, right? We don't have enough testing kits. Okay, we have Indian companies that can produce testing kits, fine. Now, it turns out that in order to have a proper testing kit, you either need the CE, the Certification European or whatever they call it, or you need to be certified by the National Institute of Virology in Pune, right? But even after getting that, you need another certification. You need permission from the DGCI, the Director General of, like, Drug Controller General of India or something. And there are things that we know have the certifications. They've received approvals from the National Institute of Virology, but they are held up in this bureaucratic process, right? And there are many, many such kits. So despite all of this crazy stuff going on, there, you know, the bureaucracy is still around. It is still slowing us down. You know, we have all of the kits that have been certified as sort of CE and are available in India. I think there's like 60 something different kits from 49 companies. Around 4 or 5 of those are Indian companies that produce certain kits. But everything else would have to be imported, so it's slowed down, and many of the others haven't gotten permission yet. So we really need to speed up the permissioning of those kits. But then again, on top of that, there's the question of, okay, you have the kits, but you need to also have a certain level of sort of everyone's heard this term now, PPE, and sort of sanitization in the labs that conduct these tests. Of course, that's not so important for these tests. The ones that I mentioned right now, these are the rapid tests. These are usually serological. The antibody tests, those are, you don't need to be that careful. But I think we need to be extremely aware, and we need to base our decision-making on the fact that there are many people in India who are suffering terribly right now, right? There are people who are out of money. There are people who are starving, right? There are people who have lost their businesses. And if we carry on like this for too much longer, they're going to do something crazy. They're going to do something bad. I would do something bad. I would go out of my house. I would stop caring. I would say, let them die. I need to eat. And I think we need to take very responsible and empathetic actions to prevent that from happening. I think people agreed sort of for the most part to the lockdown up to the 14th, but the second whammy has had a terrible effect on people's mental health. And unless we get out of this lockdown and we take responsible steps right now, we're going to see a lot of bad outcomes in the longer run. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me. I'm just going to stop scaring you and sharing my screen, and then I'll go on to asking questions. Okay, answering questions, sorry.
Thank you, sir. This was a wonderful talk indeed. We have a few questions on our YouTube comments. The first question is, it's said that even if we were to flatten the curve this time, there is bound to be second wave of similar spread. Is there enough evidence of that? What is your view on it?
Sure. So we've seen multiple waves occur with other things. So for example, with the so-called Spanish flu, there were 3 sort of fairly large waves. And that's just a sort of mathematical result. It's yes, even if we flatten the curve now, without a vaccine, it's going to come back. And that's exactly what we were talking about in terms of the lockdown, right? What the lockdown has done, it has reduced the number of active cases per day. Sure, but the moment we reduce the lockdown, you let it grow again. And that's what the entire light switch method was about. You let it grow to a certain extent. When you see it's getting out of control, you squeeze it one more time. And then you let it grow again, you squeeze it one more time. And you keep doing this, hopefully giving yourself enough time to A, build a vaccine, and B, if you can do this in some way for long enough, you build up the so-called herd immunity, right? I hope we won't have to do that, but you know, again, a full lockdown is likely not a repeatable solution. People are going to stop obeying. What you probably need is a far more calibrated and focused system with lots of testing, lots of contact tracing, declaring hotspots, having different degrees of and different severities of lockdowns in and around those hotspots. You need to have a fairly careful way and standardized way of deciding what's a COVID case, what isn't, as in a COVID death, and what isn't, and stuff like that. There needs to be a lot of organization around all of those things.
So we have another question. We have, what will be the impact of COVID-19 on people's behavior? Will they become proactive and practice preventive healthcare?
That's really hard to say. My guess is this is going to have some kind of lasting effect on people, because like I said, this thing is not going to go away, right? It's not just going to vanish. We're going to live with it for many months, if not years. And that sort of long-term physical distancing, the reduction of large group programs and things like that, it has put us into a new reality, right? So there will be certain behavioral changes around that. Whether that leads to individual changes in sort of preventative healthcare, unfortunately, I'm going to be rather cynical about that and say no. What I do hope will happen, however, is that governments will begin to see the light in terms of providing better healthcare to their people. The Indian government, like many other developing countries, spends nowhere near enough on healthcare, right? The Ayushman Bharat scheme and some other schemes have been have indicated that the government is thinking about good things, but we need so much more. We need to allocate perhaps something around 10% of government spending towards this. And we need to focus a lot of our efforts into long-term healthcare management in terms of helping poor people get better healthcare.
So last question that we have here is that we often hear a lot of people saying things like the mortality rate of COVID is not that much. It's not as dangerous as all the other diseases. And there's a lot of data that also people throw at us to support this kind of claim. How is it then that we as citizens can be more mindful of accurate and relevant data for that matter while we're making any kind of assessment of the impact of a particular disease?
So it's the joke about how to handle a porcupine. The answer is very carefully. You can't. You have to be very, very careful with a lot of this data, right? I was watching TV the other day and they were talking about how people are panicking because they believe the disease is now waterborne. The actual paper was about how in large areas, with the lack of tests, people wanted to do pooled testing. You take multiple samples together, test them in a lot, and then test subsamples and sort of hone in with fewer numbers of tests. And some other people said, well, why don't you just test the sewage, right? If you test the sewage and you detect a certain concentration of amount of virus in that sewage, then you can make certain assumptions about the population that sewage came from and stuff like that. And people read that paper and then started saying, oh, if someone, the standard sort of untouchability stuff immediately came up in terms of can you drink water from the same source and things like that, right? So one has to be very, very careful. And on the plus side, there are many, many scientists in India. There's a group called INSCICOVID. I'll send you a link later. There, INDSCICOVID. We also have NCOV India. There are many other organizations that have gotten together and trying to do a lot of science communication. But yes, in order to actually answer the question you asked at the beginning, which is, there is an underlying sort of like, wait, only a few people are dying, more people die from like car accidents or whatever. So like, why should we even care about this? Like, let's just go along. This is too much trouble. And the answer is yes, it is too much trouble. But if, again, I think I mentioned compound interest not too long ago. The problem is with compound interest. It's that old story of grains of rice on a chessboard, right? It doubles from 1 to 2 to 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and so on. And you think 1, 2, 4, 8 I can handle. And boom, suddenly you're handling millions, right? To go back to that example I mentioned before, if something doubles every week, it takes 10 weeks to go to 1,000 cases from a single case. 2 to the power of 10 is 1,024, right? Now, 1,000 cases doesn't sound like very much. 10 more weeks, 2.5 months later, you're at 1 million, right? And then every week, if it doubles from 1 million to 2 million to 4 million, and now you're in trouble. Your healthcare system cannot absorb that many cases, right? You run out of ventilators. You must have seen the scenes in a place like New York, right? In places like Italy, it was absolutely horrific. There were hospitals that were literally, I know of friends who were in hospitals which were putting out requests to local people to help make masks for them. And that's in a place with so much manufacturing capacity and money like the US. So unless we get a handle on this disease when it's still small, by the time the compound interest makes it big, we'll be in too much trouble to care about anything else.
Thank you, sir. So we would just like to ask for your key takeaways from this entire talk.
So I'm happy I could chat with you about this, and I hope the people who are listening have been able to get some more data off of this. I think the main takeaway that I have is that I really hope that this can act as a wake-up call for the powers that be, right? And that, by the way, includes each one of us. We have infinite potential, and it's important to put that potential to the right use. And we need to interact more with our governments. It is completely incorrect to suddenly, like I said, expect your government to do everything for you. I think we have to sort of take our own steps. I'm so glad that we see so much good also happening at this time. I've seen my own family, so many of my friends and relatives uh, taking out their own money, helping feed other people around them. So there's also a lot of good stuff happening. I just wish that it hadn't taken this hard a hit to make that good stuff happen. Uh, there were poor people suffering even before this happened, and there are poor people suffering even worse now, right? And I'm just hoping that all of this bad stuff can help us focus on the people who are most in need, and so that we can redirect some of our resources to help them better.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. This was been a wonderful talk, and
More importantly, exactly on time, 8:01.
yeah, and we're very, very glad that we were able to connect with you, and this was very insightful for us and all of the viewers as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.